You're welcome to the LSW platform again. And if you recall, we were talking about um, Maurice as very important in talking about our modern take of liberal humanism as we know it today. Maurice can be described as a man of several parts that tried to do something very unique in terms of reconceptualizing the English identity as regards bringing about the integration of the common man and basic education to everybody, in the context of the British life. He is a person better known as a clergy, just like his father was. But then he translated that ministry in Christianity into several aspects of the English life as it was known then, and intervened in so many ways that informed his, well, perhaps unconscious theorization of liberal humanism. Maurice was born in 1805 and died in 1872. He came from a family that was very emphatic on Christianity, and he had a father, Michael Maurice, who happened to be a clergyman. He was somebody, his father was somebody who was known to be a very important figure in the Unitarian conception of Christianity in his days there in the 19th century England. By Unitarianism, we're talking about an idea of God being one and not what we conceptually understand as Trinity today in Christianity. So the idea of the unitary in the term of the Christian conception of Unitarianism, but then you discover that it was trying to talk about the Father as the basic figurehead of Christianity, that the co-partnership of the Holy Spirit and the Son was rather extraneous. In other words, the Father was predominant and the Son and the Holy Spirit just happened to be figures, so to speak, that might just be aids to the Father, so to speak. But then, Maurice's father also felt that there was a need to educate his child in such a way that he would not only be a very formidable scholar, but also have a very basic Christian education. So, to start with, his dad was a very important mentor in his life. And Maurice became somebody that was growing in education, and eventually he got admitted into University of Cambridge. He read law and he came out as a first class graduate. But in the course of his inquiries in academics and all that, definitely he began to have certain radical ideas, critical interrogations of certain elements around him, especially since in England then there was this kind of political gap between what political bodies like the Chartists, who foregrounded the necessity to incorporate the common man in politics, okay, and other people, radicals, who felt that the moment of elite governance coming from the aristocracy, okay, that did not allow the integration of the masses in terms of the suffrage and voicing in politics should stop. So this informed a number of ideas that became radical positions in Maurice. And with time, he began to even interrogate his very Christian basis of worship. And with time, he broke away from the Unitarian Church and began to grow in such ways that he was foregrounding a kind of socialist figuration of how society should be run. He was sacked as a professor at one point or the other because of his radical views, and then later he was one of the very important people that started what was called Christian socialism. The idea was to bring in the forces of the masses of the people, the working class, the voiceless in society within the idea of Christianity. And not only that, it began to privilege the conception of a worker's education, which was to be aligned to the taste of the middle class. In England then, the elite class was seen by radicals from the left, that is, radicals that questioned the excesses of the elite class. Okay, they were seen as part of the global elite that extorted people and silenced the majority of the people from owning their identity in the national life of England then. And then it began to foreground the necessity for a kind of socialist education, if you don't mind, a kind of education that would allow the edification of the masses and make them go beyond what later on a theorist called Franz Fanon, although in another context, would call the wretched of the earth. It was trying to lift away the people from the downtroddenness they had been into the platform where they would have the capacity to resonate, to make their voices known within the political and social society that was controlled by the elite class. Along that line, Maurice began to do a number of things by educating men. He started a Bible study and had a kind of situation in which most of the people that attended his study were from the masses, the class of the workers that were often denied their social rights. And with time, he began to disseminate his information of social change, which was actually encapsulated in high levels of codes of morality. We must say that the idea of Maurice was a very basic Christian idea that looked at society as not something that should operate within what was going on in England then, within a spirit of competition. It was somebody that distrusted and abominated competition and saw competition as the bedrock of selfishness and the promoter of ideas that excluded a mass of the people just for self-gain of whatever you could say in society. In other words, it was also against individualism. Rather than that, it felt that there was a need for a socialist conception of society, which would allow the incorporation of the masses and allow them to operate in the fabrics of society. By extension, in terms of religion, education, it was also bringing out a context where anything that could civilize men and make them ennobled should be allowed. In that context, literature was seen as very valuable. For somebody like Maurice, literature presented a platform that could ennoble, that is, make the humanity of people upgraded, make the humanity of people, better realized. And along that line, whether he was conscious of what he was doing, the birth of what we call in contemporary times, the birth of liberal humanism started. His idea of liberal humanism was to allow the mass education and mass indoctrination of people along what he saw as something very positive, which will be trans-class, that is, it will go beyond class dichotomies, class gaps, and it will be something that will be able to allow a common Englishness, a common form of how you looked at English identity. So for him, there was a need to progressively make sure that such downtrodden context of the masses will be taken off economically and socially, and also that the excesses, the oppressions of elitism and class glorification in England should be stopped. So for him, the middle class represented the ideal of Englishness. So for Maurice, liberal humanism as an idea of approaching literature was a way in which the text could be seen as a way of affecting everybody in terms of principles, in terms of character, in terms of how to appreciate people and bring them into a formation whereby they could mean well for one another, grow up a society together, and do a number of things that could be of the common good. So we may say that the conception of liberal humanism in literature, as foregrounded in Maurice, was actually expostulating the ideals of socialism, was actually bringing the text, the literature, into a platform where you could say that it had a kind of utility that was something that went beyond anything that could divide people in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of background, race, and so on and so forth. And that was why liberal humanism began to come up as a very strong ideal of looking at the best of literature. I told us in the last encounter before this session that liberal humanism will emphasize the fact that good literature always transcends time, that the text in itself was self-concealed, self-ennobling, self-subliming, and that form and content were unified in the production of literature. Along that line too, we also said that the idea of innovation was something that liberal humanism would ignore, for rather something of very, very naked, very, very observable context of literature that anybody could recognize or realize anywhere and see that this is what we mean by literature. So Maurice, we can't say that in his own idea of literature, began to see literature as something universalist, something that brought all human beings together, something that had educational value, that had character formation value, that at the end of the day has a platform of growing universal humanity into one, and therefore making for unity. Having said that, we want to look at liberal humanism from the context of what it has contributed to literary studies and how it has also definitely shown certain weaknesses that we should be able to point out right away. I'll start from its strengths. However, people disparage or go against liberal humanism, of course, it has obvious gaps that we are coming to very soon. We'll find out that liberal humanism had certain very important strengths that still endure, in how literature is universally conceptualized. Anyhow it goes, whether in the ranks of some political divides or in the ranks of certain ideological formations or even aesthetic deployments, we still find certain things that are basic about literature. The fact is that, number one, liberal humanism can be praised for the fact that it brought out literature as a fundamentally human phenomenon, something relevant to humanity anywhere. Despite the fact that it might be talking about a monothematic proposal of literature, but then it actually brought literature within the context of humanity. Number two, the literary texts as brought out by liberal humanism can be seen as a very important production of imagination. Whether implied or actually pronounced, in liberal humanism, you will discover that literature is seen as a very aesthetically contagious phenomenon that human beings are indebted to in the course of their personal and corporate development. Number three is that liberal humanism tended to unify people into a body rather than into class dichotomies or racial dichotomies or gender dichotomies. Number four is that liberal humanism can still be praised for the fact that it emphasized the merging of form and content as a very aesthetic projection in which, when you are lost as an audience, the ideas on form or content don't come to you. You are just enjoying a particular story. You are just enjoying a particular literary event. And you are able to do a number of things by consuming that form of literature. Having said that, we want to look very briefly into the very important issues of its weaknesses. Number one, we'll find out in the first instance that liberal humanism excluded theory, criticism, perspectives from the enjoyment and consumption of literature. It, by extension, posited literature as not very valuable as a political tool. When you talk about politics, you are talking about perspectives of how things are run. Politics is not uniform, it is diverse. So it takes away the potency of literature in being very involved in political moves. But ironically, that was exactly what liberal humanism was doing. It was, by implication, involved in the politics of the day in England as understood and lived by F.D. Maurice. It got involved in a socialist perspective of politics that involved people, every class of people, within an idea of a social common good. Number two is that liberal humanism did not and still does not value the fact that theory and criticism are actually part of literature. In saying that literature should be able to ennoble, liberal humanism was by extension talking about the fact that literature was aligned to the dialogue of classes, the dialogue of how people should be perceived within society. And of course, you can't ignore the background of Maurice in this kind of thing. So liberal humanism itself is implicated in the very thing he was actually kicking against. Number three is that liberal humanism, in ignoring theory as basic in consuming literature, but was making a positional statement about literature as having to respect certain fundamentals of aesthetics, certain fundamentals of humanity, was by implication getting into theory, and indeed theorized. Because what is theory? Theory is a way of making a positional statement about phenomena. It is a way of also prescribing the boundaries of its statements, and also it is a way of circulating its views for acceptance to people. So by extension, liberal humanism was and is implicated in all these things. It's theoretical because it's positional in its statements, it's prescriptive in its statement, and it circulates in its intentions, in its proposal. Number four is that liberal humanism does not appreciate literature as integrally inscribed in politics of racial or gendered or class and all such in its delivery. To assume that everybody enjoys literature the same way is to present literature as a lifeless phenomenon that does not speak to particular issues that concern certain kinds of identities, subjectivities, peoples, and times. For all William Shakespeare was, there are a number of his texts that will be taken up as very, very offensive to certain readings of certain audiences. For example, and even literature speaks to literature, okay, in interrogative means. In the first lectures, when this platform was starting, we tried to talk about the whole idea of theory and criticism, that literature in itself is embedded in these activities. We're trying to say, for example, if you recall, that Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, even though we could see it as a novel, as a creative form of writing, can be seen as a theoretical formulation that is inscribed in an anti-colonialist kind of lifestyle or presentation that some colonialist literatures had been projecting. And we were trying to say that in writing Things Fall Apart, Achebe was by extension, speaking critically against the assumptions of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness of Africa as a dark continent. So if I were to read the way Achebe read Joseph Conrad, I would be reading in a very combative manner. By extension, I am not enjoying the original literature that is informing my position of that literature. So Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, together with some other colonialist write-ups like Cyrida Haggard's She, the Return of Ayesha, Rudyard Kipling's write-ups, a number of them, and even William Shakespeare, you'll find out that we need to understand literature as a political kind of presentation, which is not neutral to politics. In William Shakespeare's The Tempest, post-colonial critics will tell you that the inscription of characters like Prospero, Miranda, as human beings apart from characters like Caliban and Sycorax, it's a divisive kind of way of talking about the superiority of the Caucasian race over the so-called wretched of the earth of blacks in Africa, or the black race everywhere in the world, in the Caribbean, Latin Americas, and even in the United States, Europe generally, and Canada, and so on and so forth. So, in writing The Tempest, critics and writers like Aimé Césaire happens to be one of the arrowheads of a movement called Negritude, which was privileging blackness in a very racially charged control of the world of his time. So his response to the colonialist figurations of The Tempest informed him to write a rejoinder in aesthetic terms, even in the dramatic genre, which he called A Tempest. And in A Tempest, there is a kind of revision of all the colonialist excesses of Prospero, okay? And even the metaphysical dimension of presenting Ariel as the sublime spirit that was controlling space, okay? In Aimé Césaire's A Tempest, there is the introduction of Eshu. Eshu is a deity that in Western terms can be called the devil. But Africanists will tell you that Eshu does not mean the devil. It means a god that is a trickster, somebody that subverts things, and so on and so forth. So Eshu in A Tempest becomes a foil to Ariel, becomes a kind of force that interrogates the metaphysical control of humanity in the way it was done in The Tempest as something that had the privilege of Caucasian control. And another thing is that as far as liberal humanism is concerned, it totally ignores the potential of gender in the reflection of literature. The whole gamut of feminist literature, as we call it today, gives us a situation where literature is actually seen as not a kind of aesthetic that is neutral to politics. Feminist literature foregrounds the interrogation of patriarchy, of phallocentrism, of male excesses, of a male-centric running of ideology, of knowledge, of space, of time, and of human relations. We've had a number of feminist responses in terms of how in feminist literature, okay, the foregrounding of woman, the female body, as protagonist and as an identity that can make a marginal voicing against an enemy discourse of a dominance of power coming from man is something very, very clear. For all its matters, do you know, as enjoyable as Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is, even to blacks, okay, that it is actually a kind of politics of responding, revising, texts like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and the other texts I've mentioned. Do you know that very, very clearly, feminist views of Achebe's Things Fall Apart can be very, very shocking. For instance, there is a critic called Florence Stratton who wrote a particular response in the course of bringing about feminist reactions to literary development in the world. And something that really struck me in reading Stratton was that when she began to talk about Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you'll be shocked at the next thing I'm going to say. She literally saw it as a failed novel, and that would dazzle anybody anywhere. You know, our argument that for all that matters, the presentation of Umuofia, the Igbo village that comes to our purview in that novel, is a representation of maleness, the male humanity in that Igbo land, which excludes more than about 3/4 of its other humanity composed of women and children. That was shocking. And that for all that mattered in Achebe's idea of Things Fall Apart then, the pre-colonial African village or African society was within the domain of male control. So that the ideological circulation of society, of identity, of belonging were actually manipulated as a male preserve in society, and so many other things like that. Then we might also add this, that in presenting the literary text as self-contained, in other words, as a monothematic presentation, and the literary text as necessarily a universalist thing that everybody anywhere in any age will consume and enjoy it within the same level of satisfaction, liberal humanism was by extension denying the textuality of the text. By the textuality of the text, we are talking about how a text is so multi-layered that it can be seen and read from several perspectives that don't meet within a particular center. By extension, liberal humanism was denying the very dynamism of the text it was trying to present for us to have. Our next lecture is going to produce more interventions in theory and criticism, and we are coming in the next class into the domain of formalism, which you will find out continues this dialogue among theories and aesthetics, and getting certain things from liberal humanism, taking some other things away from its purview. I want you to know that we are continuing, and the next lecture is something to watch out for. It's something we should be looking out for. Let us begin to like this channel. Let's subscribe. Let's share it. Let's make it something that can be consumed by all, but not in the liberal humanist sense, in the sense of individual self-enjoyment. Thank you very much.